Hello, I'm Francisco from Neural DSP, and today we are in another episode of Inside the Machine podcast with Lasse Lamert. How are you, man?
Hi, man. I couldn't be better. How are you?
Yeah, fine. Just enjoying still the 30 degrees. I'm sweating every night. I can't sleep, but weird for Finland, but it's cool.
Well, it's nice to finally have a summer here in Europe as well, isn't it?
Yeah, true. That's true. So, for the people that don't know you, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I run a recording studio out of Lübeck, Germany, just north of Hamburg, LSD-Studios. And, well, that's what I do. I produce bands, I record bands, not only out of my own facilities, I also go to other places. I've been recording bands in America and Australia, India, Thailand, like anywhere really. And yeah, it's mainly, I do the whole package. I do production, recording, mixing, mastering. And a lot of people probably know me as like the Kemper guy or the guitar amp guy, because I've started early to be really interested in guitar sounds, and I collect amps and, well, do guitar sounds. And eventually just Kemper approached me about a profiler pack when that came out, and I did the first pack with them in 2011, I think it was, or 2010 even, so very early. And since then, I kind of became this Kemper guy. So people that aren't really into production or music production, recording, often still know my name or don't even know that I'm producing and mixing. They just know me as the guy that is the Kemper Profiles. So that's like another path I've taken a couple of years ago.
You still do some profiles for Kemper, or did you just upload them on your own, or it was like officially done?
I did this official pack a while back, and we've been talking about another, like a crunch pack or a clean pack or an add-on of some sort, but it never really happened for various reasons. Both parties were still interested. It's just there's so much going on. So I did release a few of my own profiles, like high-quality custom profiles, not a bundle, but just a single profile that works for a lot of people. I'm doing a lot of custom tailored profiles for artists, working with a lot of bands there, and a lot of professional bands are using my profiles, like Ollie of Evil or Whitechapel. I've done stuff for Pretty Maids and like a lot of bands really. And about half a year ago, the kind folks of STL Tones from Australia contacted me about a profile bundle. So I did that earlier this year, and that's just been released March, and it's going pretty well so far. So yeah, that's a massive bundle, the Lasse Lamert producer pack from STL Tones. So if you want to check that out.
Okay, great. That's a good advice. So how did you start on this business? Like, did you start playing guitar, or you started just studying, or did you start as a musician, as an engineer? How did it go?
Like many people, I just played guitar. And that was my hobby, and I studied physics actually. And so at some point, I just figured I do love physics. I still do, but I didn't want to work in this day job, or I wouldn't be able to, because I'm this scatterbrained kind of guy, and for me it's hard to motivate myself if it's not for myself, or coming out of myself from my own job. So I was thinking about being self-employed. And so I studied actually recording production at McNally Smith College of Music. And yeah, it just went from there. I just started working out of the college's studio. Back then they had a European campus that had a small studio, not even a studio, like a home studio set up where I recorded bands. And it just developed from there really.
Okay, that's cool. And how did you start facing your first customers? Like, did you get your reputation just because you sounded great all of a sudden? Or like, how did it escalate so you are in this position now that you can live on it?
If I even knew. I think it's very difficult in this business to not only get high-profile clients or clients at all, but then maintain a steady stream of income. That's probably true for everyone. What I did is is the standard way in the 2000s, I think, is just being online and forums were huge back then, and like a lot of people, I think you've talked to Ermin as well, and he mentioned the Sneap forum. That was huge for me as well. Just like a small, tightly knit community there that just learned from each other, and all the people we were looking up to back then, or I'm still looking up to, and Sneap, for example. Those guys posted there and just freely shared their knowledge. So I just absorbed everything I could and just tried to get better in any possible way. And I just worked on a lot of local bands. And I think what was my main, well, I don't want to say breakthrough because I'm still waiting for the breakthrough. But the biggest thing for me, or what from where it all took off, was when I recorded a demo for a band called Ailstorm, back then still Battleheart actually, and they got signed through Napalm Records. And well, they developed to be the next big thing, really. And then I did a lot of folk metal. It came from there. Bands like Svartsort and Huldra and a lot of folk metal bands, because that's where Ailstorm initially came from, like the folk metal background. Although they've since developed into something else, more modern, I guess. But yeah, that's where it started, with bigger name clients, I guess.
And did you start right away working on metal music, or did you start with just with whatever came up, or it was always rock and metal?
No, it's always been all sorts of music. It's primarily metal, not only because of my taste, it's just because like one client brings the next kind of deal, word of mouth. But I'm still doing other stuff as well. I've done jazz and ska and even hip hop, and I kind of enjoy working on other stuff, to be honest, because it keeps you fresh and on your toes, and you have to use different techniques and apply different methods, and it's quite interesting. And after all, I think if you're good at mixing metal, you should also be good at other styles, because it's the same principle, even though you might be dealing with different instruments or different arrangements, but you still need to do what's best for the song. And working with other kinds of music and different styles, I think that it just keeps you fresh, because it challenges you to, well, really listen to the song and look at the project at hand and just do whatever is best for the artist. And I want to take the same approach for my metal bands. I don't want to just use the preset or template method. I always approach everything from scratch. So
how do you think that learning curve has been for you to learn what the music needs, and also in different styles? It's a curve of learning that it takes time, I guess, and good taste and good techniques, and combining all these things on your mind to take the right decisions. Do you think that curve of learning for you was because you were able to work in different styles, or it was because you are also a musician, or where do you think it comes from, and how did you develop it, or it was natural?
I didn't consciously develop it, I think. I'm not even sure if I have it. I hope so, but I think it comes from my approach of producing, and the way I do that is I think you have to hear the sound in your head before you even start placing the first mic. So you have to have a pretty decent idea of how it's gonna sound, or at least the direction, because that determines the angle I point a snare mic to the snare, for example, or the speaker I choose for a guitar, or even the strings I choose for a bass guitar and stuff like that. So if I don't have an idea before I even start, I'm just going blind, just hoping for the best. So that's always been my approach, to listen to the music and to talk to the band to see, okay, where are we going and where are we taking this? And that just came naturally because it was the most logical way for me. And I think it's probably the best way, especially if you're producing as well. So that kind of it just developed from there.
Did you get to that point experimenting, or it was most of the studying? I'm
still experimenting. I think. That's because I don't use templates and presets. So I like trying new stuff. Or when I get a new plugin or a new amp or new microphone, I have to use it, and I try to fit it into the music. I'm not forcing it in there. If it doesn't work, if it harms the band, I'm obviously not going to use it, but I'm trying to make it work. And usually in the process, you learn something because you have to do something differently. And so that's then another tool in your toolbox that you can use next time. So this open-mindedness, I think, is a good way. So I constantly try new stuff. And that's sometimes, like, people ask me, how do you do this or how do you do that? And I can't even answer it because I don't have this one method that I'm using. I'm not always using a 5150 with the same settings in a Tube Screamer, for example. It's just, I'm just experimenting and trying to make stuff work. And a lot of that, I think, came from working with those folk metal bands early on, because that is some intense and dense and convoluted stuff, really. Like, I had, let's say, 4 tracks of distorted rhythm guitars and 2 tracks of clean guitars and acoustics and a hurdy-gurdy and bagpipes and the flute and the violin at the same time, and vocals and drums, of course, and maybe a lute. So there's a lot of stuff that's like occupying the same space. So I had to come up with ways to make it work, to create space and to mix around the issues that an arrangement like that brings. So I guess, yeah, I've always had to experiment and learn from that. And it's not always, like, the first result wasn't always the best, obviously. But with every production, I learned something, and I then applied it to the next production. Not maybe the same method, but the idea behind it, the approach. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very important to experiment and don't expect that something that the tool, whatever it is, that the amplifier is gonna do that, the EQ is gonna do that, the compressor is gonna do that. Like,
exactly,
the tools can be used in different combinations and in different settings. And even though some gear is very well known to sound or to react like this, that doesn't mean that you need to use it like that. It's good to have the knowledge and to understand that that's the way people have been using it for 20 years, but that doesn't mean that's the only chance. And it's good to encourage people to experiment, because that's how things change. That's why the sound has been from the 70s until the 2000s. It has been evolving. Like,
exactly,
until the 90s, the consoles maybe were the same still, like analog gear and like big SSL consoles, but just fresh ears and fresh people started using it differently and creating different routings on it and trying different stuff. And it's always about that. So it's very nice that you also have that same approach.
Yeah, and it's often out of necessity, really. Like, if you come up with a new approach, it's usually not because you want to, but it's because you have to, because you're facing a problem of some sort, and it's always been like that. So yeah, necessity kind of creates the need to develop and evolve, and that's a good thing. For example, people so often ask about amp settings and stuff like that, and that approach is so dangerous, I think, because obviously, like 5150, let's say, there are settings that works and that they will work decently for everyone, but you'll never get the perfect sound, and there's so much more going on. Even if we were just talking about guitar sounds and guitar chain, and people are just focusing on an amp setting that was used in a certain record, and there's the speaker, which is so much more important, has such a bigger influence on the tone, and then there's the play, and there's all the other elements of the mix, and people tend to not understand that. They kind of try to pick and use different sounds from different productions. I often have bands tell me, like, oh, I want the snare from, don't know, that Pantera sound and the guitars from Behemoth or whatever, and not even considering the whole picture, and that if the snare sounds fat in Pantera, it might just get totally lost when you combine it with the dance guitars of another band like Parkway Drive or whatever. So this whole picture, to have that in mind, and that is, I think, the job of the producer, to kind of have that picture in mind before you even start. That's what I said earlier. So you kind of have to sometimes stop the people a little bit if they're getting too, I like this snare and that guitar, and they just try to match different tones. Yeah. But for some reason, people still think that's the way to get a good record. Just, I mean, obviously you want to use references or reference material, especially if you're mixing in a room that you don't know very well or on speakers that you don't know very well. But that doesn't mean you have to match the sound, because at the end of the day, even if you match it perfectly, which you won't, it's just a very good copy. And it's always going to be obsolete. The sound's always going to, it's been used before, so you're always going to be a copy of something that's been out like 5 years ago or whatever. So it's always better to just approach it from scratch and give the band their own sound.
Yeah, and there's many things that during this process of trying to find that sound, first you will get knowledge because you will face problems that you will have to solve, and you will learn on the way. And then second, if you don't nail it, which is the whole point, like not to nail, because as you said, you will end up as a copy. You will start forming your own sound, and then when you want to get a sound somewhere there, you know how you did it, and somehow what you did on the way and which problems did you solve. And the next time that you want to do something different, you know what not to do. So all this knowledge starts to get into your toolbox, rather than if you just copy and like see a manual, the amplifier has to be in presence 5, bass 0, and you don't do it consciously. So you're just copying something that somebody said that you should do. And that's not exactly how you learn. Like when you face the amplifier, and talking about guitar tones, I want something like with a lot of mid-range, and they're like, okay, so how I do it? Of course, in the amplifier it's pretty simple. You just boost the mids, but then it starts affecting in all the chain. Like, where do I put the microphone to get that mid-range tone that I hear on the cabinet? So then you start experimenting with the mic positions, and it's all about it's a very nice road that gives you a lot of knowledge. And if you want to just jump that road and all of a sudden sound like Pantera, as you said, or like with behemoth guitars, like you're not gonna learn anything if you just manage to read a book where all the instructions are there. Of course, it might help to get some kind of a reference, but I understand what you mean, and I agree with that it's just better to have the basic knowledge so you don't do bad mistakes, but then just experiment on top of that.
Yeah, because you need to develop your tools. Let's say, for example, if you got a snare that has got a nasty ring at some whatever frequency, and then you think, okay, what am I going to do? I just using this as an example because it's a classic. So you just use like a narrow sweep and try to find that frequency and then notch it. Let's say it's at like 550 hertz or whatever. So and that works, and now you've got this tool. So next time you got a snare that sounds weird, you might use this tool, but that doesn't mean you notch at 550 hertz again. It might be at 1K or 300 or whatever, but you can use the tool and you know how to approach it. And if you just use if someone else used the same 550 hertz EQ, and you just use that frequency or that EQ preset and apply to your snare, it won't work.
Even with the same snare, after 3 songs, the frequency is not going to be the same.
Exactly, yeah.
Like the snare starts detuning, the drums start detuning when you're doing an album. And even in the first track might be 500 hertz, your notch pitch in the second song might be already like 400. Then you notice that the snare has been out of tune, and you go back or tune it again, or you just move your notch. I mean, you have to solve those problems on the fly.
Exactly, and just by having learned that you can use an EQ to notch the frequency, you've got this tool in your toolbox, and you can use it next time for a different thing or a similar problem. So it's just about developing tools that you can use, and that's how you evolve in your mixing abilities, I think.
And how did you start facing your mastering approach? Like, because I guess that first you started recording. If you want to go through your history on how did you start developing these 3 or 4, if you including production and getting your hands into the music, how did you put all this palette of tools together to be able to satisfy every little niche of it?
I think it was mainly because I had to. The budgets were tiny. They're still not massive, obviously, but when I just started with like no-name local bands, I pretty much didn't have any money, so we couldn't just send it out to a mastering engineer. So I just did everything myself, and so I never did it at the same time. Some people nowadays are just mastering as they mix, kind of with a mastering chain on the mix bus. I don't like to do that because I want to hear the mix and then come back later, like next day with fresh ears and do the mastering. But I always had to do it like that. I never had the budget to have someone master it. And then at some point when we did have the budget, I started trying different people for masterings. And more often than not, I actually didn't like the result too much, because I already had something in mind with a mix and I just needed like a tiny bit of tweaking in the mastering maybe. And then the mastering engineer was just like totally bending it out of shape, like boosting the bass like crazy just to make it sound big and bassy or whatever. And so eventually I ended up, whenever I had another guy master it, I still did my own mastering chain just for the, like early in the process even. Like what I do is when I mix for a band and they're not in the room, because I don't like to mix when the band's in the room because that's getting messy. So they're here for like 2 or 3 or whatever weeks to record, and then I send them home and then I mix, and then I usually just do one song first and we send it back and forth with lists of like revisions, and I tweak stuff until they're happy. But when I send that mix, I always have got like my mastering on it already, because it will affect the overall balance of the instruments a bit or something. And I don't want to risk the band focusing on the wrong things. Like if I send the mix that's not loud yet, and all they say is, "Oh, it has to be louder, it has to be louder," they won't focus on the correct things. So when I send that band this mix, it's already mastered. So I already have my mastering chain that I might tweak slightly later, but it's going to be 80 or 90% there. So when I use someone else to master, I still have my own mastering, and most of the time myself and the band just picks my master. Not because I'm so much better than whoever is doing it at mastering, it's just because this is the picture we had in mind when we started. And obviously for me, I think it's easier to get to that result we were picturing earlier than for someone who's really fresh. But that's just my approach, and I know it's different for other people, and it can be a good thing to have fresh ears on the mastering, definitely. It's just for me, my experience has been that it's often not the case.
Yeah, no, but I follow you. Like, I guess that many people nowadays are in your same situation, that, like, you're mixing and then you try something on the master channel and it's like, oh, this is not that hard. And then you get interested and then you notice, okay, I don't like to put stuff in the master, but I will do it later. And then you start trying and it's like, why should I send this to someone else if I can maybe do it myself? Maybe it's not that hard. And then you start learning, of course, and it's very interesting to get there. But as you said, you should always like try to get more reference from people that do it professionally. So then if you're doing it right, you can have a comparison, like, okay, I like more mine, and that's completely fair. It's just completely fair. It's just that some mastering studios might have a better room and like more like prepared setup just for mastering, and people that have experience for ages mastering stuff for radio or for, nowadays you master stuff for Spotify or YouTube or whatever, like any kind of measure that you want. But I think that I would encourage people to try to do their masterings on their own just for the sake of practice. I mean, it's something that there's so much like mysticism on the mastering, like what is the mastering and what is the secret on it, and like people think that it's something very, very, very complicated and full of steps, and it's more about knowing what exactly where and when to do something. Exactly. And that I guess that it's like years and years of practice, like of not overdoing. Is exactly what it needs, and it has to be super precise. Is chirurgic work, and for that you need a lot of practice, I guess.
Exactly. I don't think it's very complicated. It's just a different approach, and that's why I try to separate it from mixing. I've got a day between and a master in a different session, for example. And I'm actually doing a lot of outside masterings as well, and I have been doing so for the past, 8 years. So I'm actually doing a lot of mastering. So I get a lot of other people's mixes and do masterings for those. And that's also helped me tremendously in learning the craft of mastering, really. Because you have to address issues with a mix that you've never had to work with before, because, if you mix, you obviously take care of that in the mix. So now I'm presented potential problems that I have to address in the mastering because someone else mixed it, and that definitely helped me learn a lot. So I'm quite confident at mastering myself right now, I think.
That's awesome. And how have you used in your mixing process, jumping to plugins or to gear? How have you used the Neural DSP Dark Class Ultra plugin? Have you used it a lot in your mixes or a lot in like tracking or?
I haven't used it that much now because I haven't had it for that long. I back before even Dark Glass came out with a B7K, I, like many people, used the other product a lot. And at some point, I had a bass player come in with a B7K, I think it was, and I was just blown away. And immediately thought, okay, I can't use the other DI thing I used to use because it's just not as good anymore. So before I even got my hardware, I ditched the other thing because I was like, okay, I can't use anything that's not. I know there's something better out there. So I just ditched the thing and used more amp sims and other stuff just because, I don't know, it's a weird thing I have in my mind. I'm this perfectionist and I'm not going to use something that I know isn't perfect, kind of. So I'd rather develop another way. And eventually I finally got the hardware as well. It's here, which I really like so much and I've been using like all the time. It's amazing. And I'm not like... When it comes to hardware and analog and digital, I'm not like old school, narrow-minded, but I do kind of, if I've got the same thing, it takes a while to convince me that the software is as good. It was similar with the Kemper. I didn't want it to work because I've got like 30 whatever amps that I loved. And I used to hate Line 6 Pod and all the other stuff that came out before. And Andy Sneap actually talked to me about the Kemper and said it's awesome, you can't hear a difference, it's great. And I didn't want this to be true because I was like, oh, it's going to render, my amp's obsolete. And it didn't, it just enhances everything. But I didn't want it to be true, and it was. And it was a similar thing with a plugin, with a DSP plugin that was like, okay, let's try this because Mike Lewis said it's awesome, and I've talked to some people in the business that said it's great. So I was okay, let's try it. It's probably not going to be as good as the hardware, but I might be able to use it somewhere, like if I need more instances. And I tried it, and I was blown away immediately because it just gave me the same sound, and it still doesn't render the hardware useless, not at all, because I'm still using that for tracking, and the built-in cap simulation is great. But it's so nice to just have the ability to like save the settings and recall them. Not even to use them on another project, just I open the session, like let's say half a year later because the band needs stems or for Guitar Hero or all that sort of stuff. And I just open the session and everything's there. And it's great. Or to use it on multiple tracks. I would never have done that with the hardware. I just used it as the intended use was for a bass guitar, and that's what I did. And now that you've got like multiple instances with a DSP plugin, you can just try it on even vocals or anything really, and it works and sounds great. And that just enhances the creativity. And that's what we said earlier. Just you have a tool that you can use like in previously unintended ways, in ways that it wasn't supposed to be used, but it still works. And yeah, I'm loving it for that. It's amazing. I'm also using it as when I use the hardware for recording. What I used to do is in Pro Tools, I opened the comment window and just put in the settings, or I took a picture and saved it in the folder. And now I just use the plugin and use the same settings and make it inactive. So I always know what I used for this project, even if I use the hardware, because that's how close it sounds. I mean, it sounds virtually identical. And the differences I do here is mainly because of input signal strength or something like that, because obviously it goes through converters and the mic preamp, so you have to get the exact same sound, have to get the exact same input signal, which is possible. But yeah, it's amazing. I love it.
Yeah, that's the difference that you can get. It's about the amount of signal that you're feeding into the plugin or the pedal. So that's something that you need to tweak, and you can overdrive the plugin quite a lot. I have to say, like you can throw a signal pretty strong and it will still respond very well.
Absolutely, yeah. And sounds great even in low quality mode. It still sounds amazing. I just used it last week for that. What I did is once a year I'm doing this. It's called Wacken Music Camp, and it's a summer camp for kids. It's actually in Wacken where the big festival is, and it's 1 week, and there are kids between like the age of 12 and 17, and they just form bands. So they come there Saturday. We all come there, and they meet each other for the first time and form bands immediately. So we've got various degrees of, age and music styles and abilities. And so you might have a guitarist that has been playing for like 3 years and a drummer that's never played drums before. So they just form bands and then have 1 week to write and record a song and then perform it in the end. And they've got like half the day, like the afternoon is like some outdoor activities, canoeing or whatever, and the other half is we sit in this elementary school in Wacken and produce their song and write the song. So I have my mobile rig for that. It's actually an old iMac, so I'm obviously not taking the whole studio, and I needed a good sound for tracking and quick mixes there. So I took the Neural DSP plugin for that as well, and since the old iMac is not that fast, it's actually ancient, and I used so many instances of it, I didn't use it on high quality mode, but on the low quality mode, and it still sounded so good that I didn't even touch it later in mixing. It's just works.
Yeah, it's just about like some oversampling configurations, and sometimes you don't need it. If you're not overdriving the pedal maybe too much, like you might not even need it to push it so hard. And it's not always, I said on a video that I did for the company, that it's not always what sounds the best. Like if of course if you understand what aliasing does and how what happens there, of course you don't want it, but I've tried it in synths, and I've noticed that effect sometimes I like it in different kind of tracks. And it's like, it's supposed to be a bad thing, and if you understand what it does, you don't want it to be there, but you can also use it as a creative tool, and maybe low quality sounds better than high quality, and it's a decision that you can make, and nobody can judge you for that.
I'm even doing that in mastering. There's a limiter it's amazing, and pretty much everyone is using it, and you can use like 16 times and 32 times oversampling, and it sounds cleaner that way, obviously. And I still often use it without any oversampling because it just adds some glue. And sometimes I don't want the very clean, transparent sound. Sometimes I just want to gel everything together a little bit. So that plugin for me, and for that purpose, sounds better without oversampling. So that's just another example of you can't just... you have to try for yourself and see what works. And sometimes it's just that bit of grit and dirt and... dirtiness that helps gluing stuff together.
And what would you recommend to people that are starting and like where not to go, or what to read, or what would be your first piece of advice that you would give to someone that is, like, for example, just getting into recording and just starting to build their first home studio, and what would be your piece of advice?
Absolutely be open-minded. There's nothing you shouldn't read. There's no place you shouldn't go, and there's nothing you shouldn't try. But try to stay away from absolutes. Like there's so many good recording classes and courses and tutorials and forums, but most of them are like anything. It becomes, I don't want to say religion, but if you teach something, often you teach your own way of doing things. And this way, you might have developed this way over years and years and years, and it's perfect for you. But you should try to not teach this way, but you should teach the approach and how you got there, how you developed that way. And I think that's very difficult, and to a degree maybe even impossible. So whenever you've got just one source you're learning from, you'll automatically copy that way of doing things, maybe. And that's never a good thing. So just be open-minded and try other stuff. And by all means, use whatever, like if you're at this recording school or that tutorial, use that, but understand why the person who taught it to you used it like that. Don't just use it because he did or she did. Just use it because you understood why it's been used like that. So that way you can tweak it. And that's pretty much what we talked about earlier. Is just be open-minded and use every single source of information you can, and just try to apply it to your stuff. And if it doesn't work, you've learned that it doesn't work, and you might have understood why it doesn't work, and you can tweak it and adjust it to make it work. And that's how you learn.
That's great. That's a great piece of advice.
And here's another important advice that makes me sound like your father, maybe, because I've been given the same advice when I started out. Obviously, if you're doing this, you're doing it because you love music and you love the job, because it's not a well-paying business and it can be very frustrating. So the reason people are doing this is because they love it and it's their passion. And that's where one of the biggest problems lies as well, because this used to be my hobby as well. Like I played guitar in a band and I made music, and that's why I started, like everyone does pretty much. And I worked like the first 7 years, I worked like 16 hours per day, no day off, not even Christmas, nothing. And back then, like my parents and friends, they were like, okay, you can't sustain it like this. You can't maintain a schedule like that because you're going to break something and you're going to wreck yourself. And I was like, no, this is actually fun. This is not work. It's fun. And at some point, you kind of, like, what used to be your passion and your hobby slips away and it becomes a job. And you end up without a relief, like without a valve of some sort that used to be a hobby. Eventually, going to band practice is maybe not that release anymore. It's just another part of your job. So what I do, if you start out, you have to work your ass off, obviously, because you kind of have to work night and day pretty much. But you do want to have something that is so not music related in order to clear your mind every now and then. And I learned that the hard way of like a couple of years in, when I figured out, oh fuck, I just turned like everyone says, turn your hobby, what you love, into a job. It's not always the best advice, because I ended up without a hobby, without a passion, kind of, and I noticed that I was already losing the passion for this job, and then what you end up with is a shitty paying job that you don't have any passion for, and you don't want to do that. So that's when I started getting into sports, and for me it was Muay Thai, but it could be anything really. I think Ermin, for example, is doing weightlifting and working out a lot, and you should definitely consider that just to keep the love for music fresh.
Yeah,
you have to have something to clear your head every now and then.
Yeah, we were talking also with more people like how to deal with creative block, or to, like, if you have been working, as you said, 16 hours in a row, like your mindset is, even though you know it's fun and you have so much passion to do this, but there's a point that whatever you're doing, it doesn't matter. Like, just pick something. What do you think? 16 hours in a row. If you do something, whatever it is, for 16 hours in a row, you need a break. And like your mind needs a break, your everything, like in this case, your ears need a break. So, and for me, because of course, when I'm doing music, I'm so into it that I can't stop thinking about it. I can't, if I'm writing a song, I just keep the riff in my mind, or the melody, or how to come up with new lyrics. Even if I just go outside, like I'm like a zombie. I just continue thinking about it. And for me, sports cut that completely, because I cannot concentrate on anything else. If I go to play football or volleyball or basketball or whatever, even go to the gym, I have to like concentrate on, playing the ball, passing the ball, on defend, and my mindset is completely there. And when I finish, like, oh yeah, I was mixing, I was doing this and this, and then you come back again to the studio and with this fresh mindset, and it's really, really good for you. And you should Absolutely. Everybody should do it. Yeah.
I've got the same problem. Like when I'm editing drums or something, I'm in bed and I'm still moving kick drums, and I'm like, oh fuck, I forgot that, and I want to do that, and then I think, okay, I have to do it now. I have to write it down, and I write it down. It still doesn't work, so I send myself an email and mark it as unread, so I read it the next day, and it's messy, and you get into this weird place in your head where you're just spinning the thought around in circles, and until you kind of resolve it or cut it, and it's so hard to cut it. And sports is what's doing it for me as well, because it's such a different activity than mixing a music.
Yeah.
So it really does help, absolutely.
In terms of production, jumping straight more into your method, are you because I guess that you're also part of this generation that had this transition between like from going completely analog or in the beginning of the digital era, and then like trying to blend these two worlds. How do you face when you're mixing something or when you're producing something? How much do you commit yourself? Do you have these like decisions that you are like, you trust so much your tools that you are, okay, I'm doing this because of this, and this is the sound I want, and then you have, for example, like 5-7 inserts in a track, let's say, and then you never go back to them all the time? Because I've noticed there's a lot of people that fall into this overdoing that okay, I'm compressing too much. No, maybe it's the EQ that has so much low end and is activating the compressor. And then like maybe if I cut more lows, but now I lost lows. And then like, it starts getting into this circle of overdoing, and in the end you have a mess.
In German, there's a word for it. It's called verschlimmbessern. It means kind of improve worsening or something like that. So I commit as early as possible. For example, I hate MIDI. Might be showing my age, I don't know, but I just if I've got MIDI, I commit and print as soon as possible. Same with, not necessarily with plugins, but with hardware as well. If I'm using, for example, on vocals, I'm using the distressor like a lot, and I just print it. I will have the unprocessed version, but I just print it because I'm confident enough that I know what I'm doing. I've been using this compressor so often. I know how to set it. I know this is going to work in the end. That also has something to do with what I said earlier. You have to have this picture in your mind when you start already. So I know this is what I'm going to do and what I'm going to use. And that's true for a lot of things, even plugins sometimes, because some plugins that I'm using are so CPU heavy that I don't want them to be on the insert all the time. The CPU has to work, so I just print them. Never go back and change it really, because there was a reason for me to do it in the first place. So I just trust myself. But I think, I've been doing this for a couple of years, so I'm confident enough that it'll work, and I print it. There are obviously advantages to keeping everything open, but for me it would just be, I would probably go back and try to fix stuff that doesn't need fixing, and I would get into this weird circle of it's not good for me. I need to commit. And also, for example, like when I'm doing the gang vocals or choir, pretty early in the process, I just sum them to a stereo track already and take it from there, because it just makes everything else so much easier if you have a clean, consolidated session. I hate opening my Pro Tools session. It looks like Tetris with bits and pieces all over the place. So I need this clean session. So I do stems for choirs and gang vocals very early and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's also very visual. Then when you have it organized, it gets very visual where the structure of the song is, where the tracks are starting. And if not, like I've found myself before when I started doing it, I had so much different tracks and pieces and like little puzzles and Tetris, as you say. And then if I wanted to fix something between like 200 tracks, and when you're starting, you just want to put more and more. Then I wanted to fix something, and it took me like 10 minutes to find all these tracks because I was very unorganized. And audio 27 between a track, everything was named, but this track wasn't, and it was not color coded, and it took me like ages to find it and just to turn it down 2 dBs. So I guess that also organization is very important.
Yeah, it kills the creativity for you, I think. So yeah, always have it as organized as possible. And just not only does it save you time, it just you can just react faster. If you just want to tweak something, you don't have to find it, and then creativity is gone again. So that's definitely the way to go. What I do, for example, with drum samples, I print them before I even start mixing. I do like a very quick rough mix, usually often even like during tracking. And I know where I want to go with the drum sounds, and I've already chosen my drum samples for that. So I print them for all the songs. And in Pro Tools, you can, like you said, color code tracks, but you can also color code groups, and that's what I usually do. So I've got my drum group, one color, the drums minus the kick in another color, the vocals in yet another color, and stuff like that. So when you have groups active or inactive, you can like immediately see what group is that, and that's so helpful, especially during editing. If I just then I want to edit drums, for example, and I want to edit the kick separately, or just the top of the kit. I just see, okay, this group's active. I've got my short key command. Okay, now it's inactive because the color goes on and off. So it's stuff like that is so helpful if you don't have to spend time looking for stuff and trying to figure out, is this on or active or grouped or not.
And when you started, did you have the same flexibility, or you got this workflow from coming from the analog world and just like having to commit on the fly while tracking, for example? Because in the old days, I was talking, I don't remember, with Forrester, I think, that this like old time, like when engineers were jumping on the studio in the 70s, I guess, or something, like if they were tracking a vocal and using the EQ of the solid state, the console, solid state, sorry, like SSL, then you have to commit on what are you gonna do, because it's gonna get printed on the tape right away. And then like this ability that they had to do things on the fly and just like decide exactly how it's gonna sound, because then you have to do everything again. You rather sing it again, or that commitment before was something that was an ability of the engineer to have, that he had to know exactly what to do right now. And I guess that because the digital era is allowing us to like decide later, it can get very messy. So do you think that you got that from the analog workflow, or is just more of organization for yourself?
I think you still have to have the same ability, because it's the same process and the same job, just earlier. Like you still have to EQ the vocals so they sound good. Now you do it later in the mix, and then you did it while you printed it. But you have to have the same mixing abilities, the same ear and the same experience. So the difference is really trusting yourself that you do it right. Because you have to trust yourself at some point. At some point, you're going to print the mix and send it out to the label or to the artist or whatever. So at some point, you will just tweak it to sound good and trust yourself. And it's just the same thing, just early in the process. And it just frees everything up for later decision. You can mix more creatively and more fluently later, I think, if you got that out of the way already. And for me, I actually started, I'm using Pro Tools now, but when I started it was Cubase. And I hated Pro Tools. I used it in college, or had to use it, and it wouldn't work for me at all. But that was because whether you come from another DAW or from analog, you kind of develop your own way and workaround. And Cubase, for example, had, now looking back at it, so many things that I couldn't do that I had to develop a workaround for that. For example, editing drums. I even actually posted a video of how to edit drums in Cubase like 8 years ago that I'm still sometimes sending out to people. And because it didn't have Beat Detective, and now it's got different like tools within Cubase, but back then I didn't. So I had to develop my workarounds. And then when I switched to Pro Tools, or tried to switch to Pro Tools because it was the industry standard, I tried to apply those workarounds I came up with in Cubase to Pro Tools, and they obviously didn't work at all. So my first reaction was, okay, Pro Tools sucks. I can't do all this. Cubase can do this, and I can't do it in Pro Tools. And that was just a switch I had to flick in my mind, trying to apply whatever workaround and way you did before to another DAW, or coming from analog to digital, for example. It just won't work. And even if it does, it might not be the perfect way of doing things. So I had to ignore and forget all that and start from scratch and develop my new workflow within Pro Tools. And that took just, let's say, 2 weeks or so, and I was way faster in Pro Tools than I ever was in Cubase. But it took me like 3 years to even try it, because I was so convinced that I can't do all this in Pro Tools that I used to do in Cubase. And I think that's the same coming from analog to digital. There's some of the old people that are like, oh, analog is so much better. Yeah, for you it is, because you develop your workflow over years or even decades, and now you try to apply it into a digital world where you have so many more, or not even more, different options. So the right way to approach it is not to try to apply your workflow to this new setting, but try to learn in the new setting. Again, the same principle we said earlier when we talked about presets, and it's always about looking at what you have and learning how to use it instead of applying what you already learned, like very religiously or rigidly into the new setting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that transition, I mean, every DAW has its advantages, and everything is good. I mean, if we talk about professional software, Ableton Live, Cubase, Pro Tools, or Logic, or like even Reaper nowadays is getting there. Like, if you just know how to work with it, and you have developed your own workflow, I mean, you can do pretty much anything with everyone. So I mean, with any software. So it's not a matter of which software do you use. It's how you learned and to use it, and how effective are you nailing what you want to do. If you want to edit drums, and how can you do it efficiently, and it's all about the workflow. And it's interesting what you say about committing, because I've heard a lot of people that have been like sending me demos, and it's like, yeah, but this is not ready, and like this is just a demo. And then like I ask like 1 year later, and it's like, no, it's still a demo, and I'm still working on it and developing. Of course, there's a curve of learning, but I feel that it's very, very hard for young producers or people that are starting on this to let things go and say, okay, this is what I can do for now, and I have to let it go and move on to the next project. And you keep learning, but it's very hard for some people to let that process go.
And that's important, because it's such a big part of the job. Often especially if you go on forums or Facebook discussion groups, and it's about some professionals mix, and then there are like a lot of, let's say, like, well, bedroom mixing warriors criticizing the mix, and you don't know what this professional mixer had to deal with. Maybe he had a tight deadline, or he had to work with tracks that were, well, less than optimal maybe. So it's such a big part of the job to just let go at some point, be it a deadline or whatever. And I don't know who said it. I read it somewhere that mix is never finished, it's abandoned. And that's just true. Because if you ever reach a point where you're like, okay, this is perfect, it can't be any better, that's why you should stop, because that's when you're not going to evolve anymore. You're not going to develop any more skills. So if you look back at your work from a year ago or even half a year ago, you're meant to say, okay, I can do this better now. It would be sad if you wouldn't be able to do it better, because it means you haven't learned anything. And that is just something you have to accept for yourself, that you will never achieve perfection, unfortunately, which is very difficult for me. But yeah, you just have to let it go and commit.
Yeah. And it's good that it doesn't exist, this perfection. If it would exist, then it will be really easy to say, this is a bad engineer, this is a good engineer, if someone would be able to reach this perfection. But since it's a matter of like, music is not perfect, sound is not perfect, and it's a combination of things that make it unique, and developing your own voice on this art of mixing and trying to nail the sound that you have in your head, and putting this technical knowledge with the artistic mindset, it's something very interesting, and it's never gonna be perfect. And as you say, it's also very important to always continue learning, and if you look back to say, yeah, I could have done this better, and it's good that you can do it now, but you have to start committing and let it go at some point. And if you think that you cannot do it anymore, then, as you said, send your mastering to someone else. Like, save your money, save your time, and then like spend it to someone that can help you out. And then from there you can try to learn yourself, and maybe next time you can do it on your own. But being stuck on the project and for many years or months, the only thing that it will do is, as you said before, as working 16 hours for many years, like, you'll start hating it. Like, you will not enjoy it anymore. You will start overthinking stuff, redoing or fixing things that don't need to be fixed. So the committing yourself, rather if it's on the plugin situation, on freezing tracks, or just to respect the deadline, and taking decisions, it's a very important thing for people to learn, and it's a very good piece of advice, I guess.
Especially if you want to do this professionally, because it's a big part of being a professional. If you, for example, do test mix for a client, let's say you've got a high-profile client, and that's the next step you want to reach, and you get the chance for whatever reason to do a test mix for them. So there are 10 other people. So if you send them your test mix and you say, yeah, well, but this is not finished and imagine this to be this and there's no automation on it yet, well, you better get it there then before you send it out, because someone else is. And the client is not going to listen to it and say to himself, like, okay, so this is not perfect, but it's because there's no automation on it and there's not... Well, it doesn't matter. If it doesn't sound as good, you're not going to get the job. So commit until you're happy. Well, you might not be really happy, but until you say I've got something that you can send out without having to make excuses before you even heard any feedback.
What are the most what are the mistakes that you have done in this process and in this curve of learning, that it will of course continue, and maybe you're doing things now that you will correct later, but during your career, what are those things that you would have wished that to do different, or that you would have changed or done differently?
I guess the biggest would be what I said earlier, to get into sports or any sort of hobby outside of music earlier. So that was that took a lot out of me, I think. Then so many small things, really. Like, for example, it's not a big thing, but in my mind it is the last 8 Storm, for example, which I was quite happy with, and I sent it out, and it still sounds good, and I'm still happy. But like, after the masters were printed and CDs were manufactured, I opened the session and I saw that H delay, which I'm using, has the noise generator still on, which I usually turn off right away. So I was like, oh, fuck. So now I can't listen to it anymore without knowing there's some noise somewhere. Even if you don't hear it, I would have liked to switch it off, and I didn't. So that's always something you notice later, and you go back and like, oh, I wish I would have done that. And that for me was a big one, because I was so happy with how it turned out, and then I like, damn it, such a small, stupid mistake. And no one ever notices. No one will ever notice at all. Or for example, in I think it was the first Glory Hammer record I did, there's one tiny editing mistake in the drums, where there's like a little flam between the kick and the snare. And no one's ever heard it or mentioned it. And I haven't heard it for the longest time, because when you mix, you get into this zone where it's so easy to ignore something like that. And like 2 years later, I listened to it and I noticed it, and I was like, fuck. And now I can't listen to it anymore, because you can't unlisten it. You can't unhear it. And that's the small things, but that's just me being a perfectionist, or I think it's true for most people, that it's so difficult to go back and listen to something you've done 2 years ago, a year ago, whatever. Because, and that's a good thing, like we said earlier, because you have developed and you would do it differently now. So it's very difficult to step back and accept that that's the best you could do back then, under the circumstances, within the time frame, within the given material, whatever. And that's so difficult for me, especially if it's just a year or 2 or 3 ago. If it's 10 years ago, well, yeah, fair enough. Sucked back then. And I hope I will say the same about myself now in 10 years from now. Well, sucked back then. I hope I will still be doing this in 10 years. We'll see.
And like, going more specifically into using equipment, was there anything on your curve of learning that for example, like learning to use compressors or learning to use EQs or all these tools that exist nowadays, like stereo imagers or multiband compressors or limiters? Is there anything that at some point you overdid for a couple of years, and then you noticed like, okay, it needs less than what I have been doing so far?
Everything that's new that I'm using, like whenever I get a new plugin, I'm using it like a lot, and it's always the same. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just when you look at it later, yeah, maybe it was a bit too much, but it was what was needed to learn the plugin, to develop the tool and put it in your toolbox, I guess. But yeah, that's very true for me. Like whenever I get something, or whenever I learn something, like when I hear a colleague talk about a new technique and I want to use it, I will use it and I will make it work somehow. Even if maybe I could have achieved the same result with a different plugin or fewer plugins or a different approach. I will get it to the decent result, but it might have been possible to do it another and easier way too. But I'll try to make it work because I want to use it and I will use it. So I learn using it, I guess.
Also on that learning curve, you talked a lot about like experimenting and trying to use things where are not supposed to be used. Which one is like something funny that you tried at some point that you would encourage people to try, or something funny that you did that ended up in a record by mistake, or?
A lot of stuff really. Vibroslap, for example. A vibroslap is a weird percussion instrument that has no place in metal. We used it on an album like 10 years ago, and now with a band I'm using on every single album there's a vibroslap somewhere. Even if it's like modern metal, it's going to be hidden in a sub drop or something. And there's another, where is it? It's somewhere here, can't find it now, but the little Marshall MS2. It's a tiny practice amp from like 15 years ago. I actually used that on a record as a lo-fi amp, where everything usually you just use it like a telephone filter, EQ or whatever, and I just used that amp instead, and I mic'd it up with a SM57 and a 421 and re-amped through that tiny little Marshall head and made it work just because I wanted to, and it worked, and it looked good on the studio blog that time. So we just took a picture and yeah, and that ended up on the record, for example. And yeah, often it's stuff that's, for example, when was it, 2000, forever ago, I did a production in Thailand, actually, and it was one of those, there was like an orphanage, and we went over there with a lot of like a German all-star team from like bigger German known bands, mainly like pop and rock bands. And so we went over there and went into the actual jungle and improvised the studio there. We had like a Mackie desk, and we went into this like literally like a hut, and so I had to actually take a 2-meter metal pole and just put it into ground to have proper grounding for the gear. And the drums we used were per export, but the heads were so dented and old that I actually flipped it over, and we used the resonant side as a better side. And so a lot of improvising had to be done back then. Or for example, the plan was to have all those European musicians, and then we were there for like almost 3 weeks, write an album with the kids. What we didn't consider was the fact that the European, like 12 tones and 4/4 beat and all that, just doesn't work with their instruments at all. They've got an entirely different system there, especially like when you go more native. I mean, obviously they've got rock music, but that wasn't the plan. The plan was not to just record European music in Thailand. So we wanted to incorporate all the kids with all the original Thai instruments. So that was very difficult to make that work, because they don't have the half tones. They've got different tones, and we had to kind of make that work and improvise. And so that was quite the challenge, where we used stuff the way it wasn't intended to use. But that was the whole project. Like, for example, we had a German singer, long dark hair. She was quite famous over here back then. And we recorded this 16 songs, I think, album, and also documentary and music videos. And for the music video, the plan was to go to Chiang Mai, one of the big cities, and record this kind of Alanis Morissette walking through the streets kind of deal, which was close to impossible, because in any place in Asia, you can't really just walk on the streets without being killed immediately. So went over to the police and told them it's Britney Spears, so they kind of shut all the streets off. And so there was this German long black-haired girl walking through the streets, and the police thought it's Britney Spears, so we could shoot a video. So that's what production is really, I think. Relatively early in my career, that's also why I switched to Pro Tools back then. I I started working in other countries and out of different studios. And back then, I like I said earlier, I loved Cubase, but if you go to another studio and you have in Cubase, you can just program your own key commands and you've got all that and you've got that nailed, and then you go to a different place and you can't work anymore pretty much. So I decided I have to switch to Pro Tools because that was the industry standard. And back then I thought having those rigid key commands and not being able to change them would be a disadvantage, but it turned out to be the biggest advantage because you go to any studio in the world and you can work. So that actually, so I flew to America and worked out of a studio, wall to wall it was called, that like a couple of Neve consoles and SSL desks and mics I haven't used before, rooms I didn't know. So you always have to improvise a lot, and it keeps you fresh. So it makes you use things the way they weren't intended to be used. Yeah. So it's just out of necessity. It's not even. I'm in my own studio and I want to experiment because it's too easy to just fall back into what works for you. But going to other places, working on other styles of music, working with different musicians in different countries, that just makes you improvise because you have to. You make it work. And yeah, that's how you learn. And I'm so grateful for having had the opportunities to do that. Like 3 years ago, for example, I recorded a band in India and we just went into this. The studio was good, but it's just such a different experience, and you present it with. You can't just go to a country like India and expect them to have everything you have in your studio here. So you just have to make it work. Whatever they have, you make it work, and that's why I'm still quite happy with the mix or the recording we did there, because I know how we got there. Like the average listener who's listening to the CD now, it just says it sounds good or doesn't sound good or whatever. But for me, I know how we got there, and this whole process was so interesting, and you learn so much. That India experience, for example, this wasn't like a touristy area. We were like in some area where they haven't seen like a proper white person with tattoos. So whenever I stepped outside the studio, I had like 20 kids surrounding me, like pulling my arm and pointing at my tattoos and stuff like that. Where you can't even, like, you learn if you go to a country like that, only drink bottled water. But even that you can't do, because in those places, if it's not touristy, like they actually refill the water bottles and like seal the little ring with like super glue or something. So even that you can't do, and you have to just learn and improvise, and that's this whole experience. It's not only the recording side. I can just encourage anyone and everyone to really do that. Go some other place and record, and even if you're shit scared. So was I. Like the first time I think the first time I recorded abroad was probably, I don't know, America, and I had no idea what to expect. I've never done that. I've never worked out of a studio that I didn't know, and the band back then thought they've heard my name from, I don't know, some forums in Kemper, and thought I was, I don't know, they've heard my name. That was big enough. Like, okay, so they expect me to be someone. They expect me to be able to do this. And I was like, oh, fuck, how am I gonna do this? And I think you just have to jump into the cold water and just like take the leap and just do it. And you learn so much from it.
Yeah, that's a very good advice also, to encourage people to go outside and change get out from their comfort zone and improvise and solve problems. We were also in the previous podcast talking with Tu Madsen that he really likes that approach of facing new problems and solve them in a different way, with different tools, with different environments, with different gear, with different mindset, with different band, with different style. That keeps you fresh, and it gives you a lot of knowledge. So if you're just like doing something that you believe that you're already good at, and you're repeating this all the time for 5 years and like nailing the same sound with the same mics and like with the same drum set and like everything, try to change a little bit, because it's gonna, even if you just change, like swap guitars or change the bass drum or change the cymbals or change the position of the mics, it's gonna give you a new perspective. So as you say, going to record to a different country, everything it's good knowledge. So that's a very good piece of advice also.
And of course, you're scared and nervous the first time, or probably every time. But that's good. I mean, be scared. So what? You're gonna make it work somehow, and you learn. Tim Madsen's a good example, isn't he? Recording drums like in a pool, some sort of swimming pool, which is like the least likely place I would record drums in usually, because it's just tiles and echoes, and I would like, this would be the worst place. But he makes it work, and it sounds so good for him. So there's no one way to do it. It's always different ways. Same for my studio, actually. Everyone's like, you need big rooms to record drums in. Small rooms suck. And there's truth to that, because, well, in big rooms, it's much easier to control the room modes than in small rooms, because in small rooms, the room modes will be further up into the audible spectrum. But for me, for example, I had this vocal booth that I built when I built the studio. And it's pretty big for a vocal booth, but it's very small for a drum room. And in theory, everyone would be like, I can't record drums in there. And I didn't intend to. I've got my live room and I've got this vocal booth. And now most of the time I end up recording drums in that vocal booth. Like the drums barely fit in there. And everyone will be like, okay, you can't record drums in there. But it works so well for me because I've got so much. I had to make it work. And I recorded it and I've got this dry signal. It doesn't sound muffled. It doesn't sound boomy, but it sounds dry. And I can always then edit and then play it back into the room and record the live room or something like that. So it's a workaround I had to develop at some point, and now I'm really liking it and it works. Same for Too Much with a swimming pool, I guess. So there's no one way of doing it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, solving problems and as we mentioned before, like things are never perfect. It doesn't matter where you are. So developing how to fix these turnarounds and how to overcome these problems, it's a very good thing to do. Yeah, I guess that now we're coming to an end, man. And this was a very interesting conversation. Like I really liked your work, so it was really good to have you. And I'm really glad to hear that you're using the Neural DSP software, and you're welcome
amazing.
to the family whenever you want.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I can just highly recommend it to anyone. Really, it's such a good plugin. It's so useful.
That's great.
It's one of those plugins. I've been using a lot of the same plugins for a long time. In the last 2 years, there were like 2 or 3 plugins that just piqued my interest that came out that I got. And of those, 3 plugins, the Neural DSP is one of them. And it made its way into my toolbox immediately. So it's such a great tool.
That's really good to hear. I hope that we can surprise you with upcoming products, and we're working very hard to challenge ourselves and get the industry standard somewhere else.
Cool. I'm always happy to check it out if you got something for me.
Awesome. Great. Well, it was really nice to have you, man.
Thanks
I
for
hope that
having me.
we can talk again soon.
Cool. Will do.
Yeah. Thank you for this. This was
Bye,
Neural
guys.
DSP Inside the Machine podcast with Lasse Lamert. So thank you for being with us, man.
Thanks.
Yeah. Take care.
Cool.